yesterday we told you about a hearing in a federal lawsuit brought by 5 pregnant, undocumented women. Just one of the federal lawsuits filed against the president's executive order that attempts to end birthright citizenship for babies born to a mother and father who are not U.S. citizens or legal residents.
Now, in that case, which is separate from a suit filed by Arizona and 3 other states in a Seattle federal court and another filed in Boston by more than a dozen other states, a federal judge in Maryland issued a preliminary injunction against President Trump's executive order.
So there is a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
Joining us again is ABC News investigative reporter Peter Charalambous to fill us in on what is next. Peter, an injunction's usually an indication of which way a judge is leaning, and District Judge Deborah Boardman made it pretty clear in her ruling she's leaning against the president on this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This was really a decisive win for the 5 pregnant women who brought this case. Deborah Boardman really slammed the Department of Justice, saying that this interpretation of the 14th Amendment is contrary to 100 years of law, saying that it threatens one of the most important rights in the American Constitution, and basically that she wouldn't condone something that runs against years and years of court precedent, the Constitution, and federal law.
So, Peter, what's next in that case, the case that Arizona is a part of, and then that suit that filed by other states in Boston?
Yeah, it's kind of an open question. Trump has vowed to appeal this entire decision, so it's possible we see Trump beginning to appeal that nationwide injunction. He could theoretically appeal it up to the Fourth Circuit and kind of begin that process of trying to shape the law through the courts. Now, the Arizona lawsuit is kind of a different question. Technically, there is still a hearing on the calendar this morning in Seattle where the Arizona Attorney General and 3 other state attorneys general are arguing before a federal judge about the same executive order. Practically speaking, the hearing is kind of moot because this is a nationwide injunction coming out of Maryland, but the judge in that case might still use that hearing as an opportunity to kind of just get some material on the record. He really kind of gave the DOJ a talking to during the last hearing, and he really might just use today's hearing, even if it meaningfully doesn't change that much, to criticize the DOJ and the government's position, given how blatantly unconstitutional he believes it was.
Now, ultimately, this is likely to land in the Supreme Court's lap, correct?
If it were up to the Trump or the Trump administration, yeah, that's exactly right. The only way to really have any chance of meaningfully implementing this executive order is if the Supreme Court comes through and says, actually, they agree somehow with Trump's interpretation of the 14th Amendment.
But the only way it's not going to be heard in the Supreme Court is if they just say, no, we're going to stand by what these previous courts' rulings have been, right?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting question to see how much control or how much loyalty Trump has on the Supreme Court. He has 3 appointees on that bench. There is a conservative majority, and they've surprised legal scholars in the past by taking up cases that most people thought were kind of out of the question. Think back to presidential immunity over the summer, where no one really thought that they were going to take up the issue, no less expand the idea of presidential immunity so vastly. So I don't think it's out of the question that the Supreme Court takes it up. And unfortunately, I don't necessarily think it's out of the question that the Supreme Court gives Trump a potential win here, as shocking as that might sound to the majority of legal scholars, just because it's a wild card at this point.
But hasn't the Supreme Court ruled against his administration before?
You know, in the first Trump administration, yes, the Supreme Court was kind of a backstop against some of the Trump administration's moves. They often kind of didn't take up issues, especially towards the end of the Trump administration when he was challenging the integrity of the 2020 election. But we're talking about a different political landscape, a different court in a way than the same court that existed in 2016. So we'll really have to see. I think this will be really one of the first cases that shows how much power Trump has over the judiciary and whether or not he'll be able to implement this by reshaping the law.
All right. Thanks so much, Peter. That's ABC News investigative reporter Peter Charalambous, filling us in on 3 separate federal cases against President Trump's birthright citizenship executive order, which is aiming to end that right of children to automatically become citizens if they're born in the U.S.
Thanks for watching Arizona's Morning News. Click to watch more from KTAR News and hit the button in the middle to subscribe.